Did you hear about Abraham Lincoln's media consultant? She was just 11 years old. Honorable A.B. Lincoln, my father has just come home from the fair and brought home your picture and Mr. Hamlin's. I am a little girl, only 11 years old, but want you should be President of the United States very much. I have yet got 4 brothers, and part of them will vote for you anyway, and if you let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them to vote for you. For you would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. Grace Bedell, Westfield, Chautauqua County, New York. Lincoln responded very quickly. My dear little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They, with their mother, constitute my whole family. As to the whiskers, I have never worn any. Do you not think people would call it a silly affection if I were to begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln. Despite his answer to Miss Bedell, nonetheless, Lincoln did begin wearing a beard. So with that context, I approach this question. Michael Alfonso writes, why do almost all modern politicians go clean-shaven? Lincoln had a beard. Teddy had a mustache. But I can't think of any prominent American with facial hair. It being politics, I seriously doubt it's a matter of personal preference. Okay, well, thank you, Michael. Not personal preference, but a mixture of fad, religion, health, or at least health ideas of the 19th century are the reason for the difference between image of presidents now and presidents then. Indeed, facial hair, seemingly unimportant, can signify some real important things. And as I get into, I think this seemingly humorous question actually signifies something great about history and politics. We'll get there. You mentioned Lincoln had a beard, but actually, for most of his life, he didn't. For that small period of his life which interests modern history buffs most, the time he was president, he had a beard. Thus, all the images, most of them, except that young Lincoln photos, we see him bearded. As a lawyer, as a congressman, he shaved. Just like Presidents Polk, Taylor, Pierce, and Buchanan before him. They all used the razor. And like our founding fathers before them would have had, Washington, Jefferson, etc., associating clean-shaven with clean, neat Romans, as of 3 centuries BC, had shaved, our founding fathers emulated in every way their idols, the Romans. But Lincoln, right after his election, got caught up in the beard movement, and without media consultants, responded to the letter that he ought to improve his image, and eventually he did don a beard before he became president. But actually, that image of the full beard you may have in your head from so many prints and common in the Brady photographs was not his only look. Many times he had just a light goatee. He alternated. Never a foo. Now, you probably have an image in your mind of all those Civil War generals, too. Grant, Sherman, Lee, Chamberlain, McClellan, and you'll notice their facial hair. Beards, at least a mustache. The Civil War was a war between men with beards. It occurred right at the time that America got a dose of the British beard fad from the 1850s and 60s. Maybe more than a fad, because it lasted a long time. Pamphlets and books were published warning the Victorian public about the dangers of shaving. The London Times often advocating the value of growing the beard. The reasons given for not wanting to shave varied. Too much time and effort. Other articles said that barbers should be distrusted, that shaving was spreading disease around. Religious thoughts. Shaving happened to be in some way ungodly. And then there were some modern health reasons. Shaving endangered the lives of men and threatened, in particular, their respiratory organs, because without a mustache or a beard, there was nothing to block the nostrils from that dirt and smog coming into the nostrils. Well, 19th century healthcare. And I think, as you can imagine, this was a strong pull for Victoria-era men, especially those who were too rich for labor. The idea that men should not shave was connected closely with the contemporary ideas about the nature of masculinity. Women couldn't grow them, only men, so show it off. It was also a way of showing your masculinity, but still being classy. You couldn't pump iron. That was for laborers. You couldn't have huge muscles. So the beard provided a convenient symbol for those gentlemen and officers of the Union and Confederate armies who wanted to show masculinity. A host of other benefits. It was civilized. It made a man look older, made Civil War generals look higher rank than those country privates who had come clean-shaven. It made imperial Victorian British gentlemen look different, superior in their eyes to colonial subjects. And, as Miss Bedell pointed out to Abe Lincoln, it could be seen to look healthier, covering up any gauntness in the face. So I think in Lincoln's reaction, you see that, like you asked in your question, he didn't do it for personal preference. Doubt he did it for health reasons. Also, and I think this is the reason there are so many bearded people back then, just a little bit of peer pressure, a little bit of the style of the time. Older, masculine, etc. As he started his presidency, thought it would be a good style. So in all the humor and funniness, I think it shows you that Hollywood didn't create image alone. Image in politics was there. This is a time before TV sets. Of course, it was a time when various photographs would go out of significant people, certainly a president. As for nowadays, by the turn of the century, by 1900, the mustache and the beard thing was fading. The mustache held on a little bit longer. Beardless Grover Cleveland beat Benjamin the Bearded Harrison. You didn't catch it on either William McKinley or Bill Bryan in 1896. Charles Evans Hughes tried, lost. That's when presidential beards ended. Mustaches held on a little longer, ended with Taft. And in 1922, clean-shaven men faced each other for the presidency. In 1924, it was 3 clean shavers facing each other for the presidency. 32, 36, 40, same thing. Dewey tried in 44 and 48, and he and his mustache lost. So it's meaningless to how you perform as a president, but it stopped nonetheless. So that tells us something, right? That there is a political reason for this image. Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada in the 1970s and early 80s, talked about how when he was defeated in the 1979 election, he grew a beard. And his advisors said, listen, if you don't want to come back and you want to signal that you're not coming back, keep growing that beard. He shaved, and Pierre Trudeau did come back for another term as Prime Minister. You don't, by the way, catch the Liberals' new leader in Canada, his son Justin Trudeau, wearing a beard, though he does have some long hair. In our politics, there is no threat of a bearded president in modern times. Our image of presidents is that Kennedy model, right? Clean shaven. Closest we came was when Al Gore donned that beard in 2001. Maybe you thought the beard was coming back to presidential life. I remember thinking, and I think this is what turned out to be the case, America wasn't ready. And the very fact that Gore grew that beard, I think showed that he probably wasn't going to enter the 2004 election anyway. Fashions among kings rotated between Roman times and the time of our revolution. Henry V, no beard. Henry VIII, beard. Napoleon I, no beard. Napoleon III, beard. Tsar Alexander III, beard. Tsar Nicholas, no beard. And so, we've only had 237 years in our country. That's a speck of human history. So I say this to thee. We are just about 100 years from beards really dying off. And definitely a no-no in politics. And 100 years is time enough for fashions to change. Now, especially when you look at so many young people adopted that bearded look, that hipster Portlandia look. And by, say, 2020, that bearded look in politics comes back. Just a guess. We're talking about beards, and it's not all that serious. But what appears to be a silly discussion renders visible how easily collective political perception changes from time to time. Right? This is a meaningless point just about a style. There's no real science about the health effects of growing beard, and growing your hair doesn't grow wisdom. Yet, people perceived and acted according to a virulent perception that was strong then and is strong today. How many other things exist in our politics that are changing over time that we can go back in history and look at and see, boy, seems so important now, but it was not a concern then. Oh, and another thing about that Miss Grace Bedell. She got to see Lincoln on a pre-presidential railroad tour of her town, and in 1864, the now 15-year-old woman asked him for a job in the Treasury Department. She didn't get it, but perhaps she should have. It was the least he could have done for what now would cost tens of thousands in media consultant fees. So from a verifiable legendary story to an unverifiable one. Mark Murray asks, Bruce, I just finished the audiobook Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition by Daniel Okrent. He made the point that although it's a given that Joseph Kennedy was a bootlegger, the facts for that claim are very slim. Given what you do know, what do you think about the claims against Joseph Kennedy? Thanks, Mark. To the level of certainty that you should have for historical discussions, especially issues of a political figure or the father of a great political figure, we don't have it. And we probably shouldn't talk about Joe Kennedy, the bootlegger. Because I think you are right that it's assumed to be given. In fact, I'll share with you something. Prior to researching it, I just didn't personally question it that much. Here's one thing that I think you can say with certainty. A lot of the accusers of Joseph Kennedy, against the father of JFK, will say, well, how did he get all that money if he wasn't a bootlegger? Now, I think there is enough research on that. Why was he so rich? He did engage in some unfavorable stock practices to get money. Types of things that would be illegal today, but weren't illegal in the early days of the stock market. Stock pumping, unloading shares. He ran a small bank, picked up some good investments, but where the real dough came in that would make for the funding of a president, he bought a British company that imported American films. He used a lot of that money to invest in various stocks, but he left the stock market before 1929, when many others stayed in. And in the 1930s, he bought the Chicago Merchandise Mart at a very low price. Price he bought it for, in future years, he could easily make in rent many times over. For the bootlegging, there were lots of rumors at the time, but most accusations came out after his son became president. And after, when the Kennedys were surrounded by conspiracy, and the bootlegging idea became one more thing for all those books, that perhaps the reason JFK was shot because of a fight that his father had gotten into long ago. And the damning charges that have cemented that history are the accusations of two figures of the underworld, Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, as well as some lesser members of the organization, like Al Capone's piano tuner, who had said in the 1970s that, oh yes, Joseph Kennedy was bootlegging. Of course, how do we know? Bootlegging was then what drug dealing is now, a secret business, no records, and poor characters who have a lot of reasons to lie. You can't really say that there's evidence he did this. Now, Kennedy was not outside the liquor business. He had access to it. He did have experience because his father's shop sold liquor up until Prohibition. And there's stories that he was the, quote, key bootlegger for his Harvard class reunion, that he found ways to provide alcohol for that event. Now, he wasn't selling it to them. On one hand, it was clear this guy, Kennedy, was one who could make money any way he could. Again, his defense here is going to come down to, I'm not a bootlegger, I'm a stock pumper. On the other hand, he generally avoided illegal activity and anything that would bring shame and link him to more of that stereotype coming from his ethnicity. This was a guy who had married the mayor's daughter, a Protestant, Fitzgerald, in order to not be seen as just another one of those Irish Catholics. There was also some halfway steps where you didn't have to actually bootleg to make money in the 1920s. For instance, there was a business to be made completely legal in just purchasing ships to go from, say, Ireland to Bermuda. There's nothing wrong with that. There was also a business in insuring ships that would then be carrying bootlegs. I mean, the only reason for these voyages would be that they were bootlegging ships. So there's all these speculation about that. With history, we're always using the best available truth to look at the present. And here you don't have it. Call him a stock pumper, but not a bootlegger. Linda Alloway writes, "Hey Bruce, were women counted for apportionment and representation before gaining the right to vote? Was reading about the 3/5 rule and was wondering." Okay, thanks, Linda. Yes, as unfair as it is, yes. The idea behind apportionment always seemed to be that you apportioned according to the total people living in a place, not the voters. The first census done for apportionment counted all persons. The person in charge of the first census was the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and he ordered that all of this be broken out. How many free white males of 16 years and upward? How many free white males under 16 years? How many free white females? All other free persons, slaves who had earned their freedom, and slaves were also counted. Indians were the only group that not counted in that census. They were not considered citizens. They were considered citizens of their own nations. And then it went to, well, only Indians who are paying taxes to the United States. And then it went to, by the 1920s, all Indians being counted. Today, all people, citizens and non-citizens, with a usual residence in the 50 states are to be included in the census. So these days, we still count children in the apportionment, even though they don't vote, and we count non-citizens who are residents, regardless of their resident status. Apportionment not directly linked to voting. I think it's always important for a country to know how many people are living in it and not to have a number that's actually lower, even though that it's never perfect. I think for purposes of government, it's important that even if a guy is here from London, living in Rhode Island, for instance, there's still a person occupying a space, and if there's a lot of them, that may require funding, and may require more transportation, may require more services, requires more needs from that state. So that's, I think, the thinking behind including everybody in the apportionment, even if they don't vote. Dave Griffith writes, "Bruce, every time I listen to your podcast, you mention states that are now solid blue or red states that were once the opposite. For example, in the Theodore Roosevelt podcast, you talk about Massachusetts going Democratic for the first time. Some believe Texas will become a Democratic state in the near future. Do you believe any of these solid states we see today, the entire Northeast blue, or most of the West red, will ever swing back and become solid in the other direction?" Thanks, Dave. Nate Silver, I am not. I do better at reflection than prediction, but okay. So first of all, yes, that was 1928, where all of a sudden Republican Massachusetts went Democrat. In an earlier podcast, I talked about how Virginia had remained Democrat since Reconstruction. It was a reliable Republican state then from Eisenhower onward, up until 2008. I still don't think you can call it a Democratic state just because Obama won twice. 2016 will be a real test. Reagan won both California and New York in 2 elections as a Republican, and neither of them were close. Those states are simply not available in recent years for anyone from Reagan's party. And there's no indication that that'll change in a presidential election in 2016. I certainly wouldn't call it yet. Early elections, 1800, 1812, 1844, these were a race for Pennsylvania in a lot of cases. It was a swing state with Federalist coastal elites, near Philadelphia, and backwoods Scots-Irish Republicans. But then, for 76 years, the state went from a swing state back and forth to a solid Republican state. Lincoln to Herbert Hoover. The state kept voting for Republicans, even voted for Herbert Hoover in 1932 for his re-election. The Republican keystone. West Virginia went for Dukakis in 1988. Now it's not even contested by Democrats. So states change. Now, what we're not talking about here is flash-in-the-pan changes, like Jimmy Carter winning South Carolina in 1976, and then a Democrat not winning that again since. Or Hoover getting North Carolina in 1928, not another Republican winning Carolina for some time. That's not what we're talking about. But we're talking about real change, and that, I think, does take a long time. You have this down ticket factor that becomes a problem. And if you're getting swamped in election after election all across the state for sheriffs, for county officials, for various state offices in those states where you have elected treasurers, for instance, you don't have the farm team to turn into senators, governors, And without that, who holds the fundraisers, the rallies? Who supports a presidential campaign in that state? It becomes hard to change a state from, say, blue to red, while Massachusetts and California become solidly Democrat. On the other hand, watch us how Arkansas and Tennessee went from competitive when Clinton Gore were running to not a chance. In fact, in these states, President Obama even had trouble in primaries. Some opponents were in jail and scored big against the president. Not that everyone knew the candidate when the primary was in jail. Inability to run on the presidential ticket and have it benefit you is going to hurt state candidates down ticket and local candidates who have to run on that banner. Without local, county, state offices, it gets tougher to turn these states. But you can always do a flash in the pan. If Democrats, for instance, run a Southerner, they could try, but I think they'll have this inherent catch-up from the runs of John Kerry and the runs of Obama, where Democrats simply weren't competing in the South at all. Tim Kaine and Mark Warner. I think Jay Nixon in Missouri is a maybe for 2016. He might mount a campaign. I'm not saying he's going to win. But winning the South is no longer the playbook, I think, for Democrats. That was more of a Democratic Leadership Council, Bill Clinton-type strategy. Democrats now, I think, are going to try with what they've been doing. North plus West, battle over the Midwest. But it's not this idea of converting like Arkansas, Louisiana, and the Deep South. For Republicans, they keep trying to open up Pennsylvania, and it doesn't seem to be working. They're trying to do it by appealing to rural voters. But really, the votes in that state are coming from the Philly suburbs. So I think that, say, Chris Christie in New Jersey, if he wins a second term, he's a possibility there if he wants to run for 2016. It's a little coarse for national politics. He has to come to terms with that. Would get you votes in the Turnpike. May not work on the Mississippi. But he has some assets, and, that's a possibility you got to look out for. And somebody who could possibly open up Jersey, Pennsylvania, and some other states. So to get it back a bit to your question about Texas, I think that's a tough one because of the down-ticket factor and the lack of attention it's gotten in elections. So if all of a sudden the Democrats decide they want to target it in 2016, it's going to be a real uphill battle. Even 2020, real uphill battle. Now, Florida is a good example of a state that may have changed. The 2016 is going to test this. It was the definition of a purple state. My open question for 2016 on the Democratic side is if they'll even contest Virginia seriously again, without having an African-American candidate, assuming they don't after President Obama's second term. But maybe if you run someone, of course, a Mark Warner, or if you run Martin O'Malley, neighboring governor in Maryland, he certainly wants the job, then, of course, you put that state in play. Otherwise, I wonder if that's left off the table. It's just not part of it anymore. So we'll see. Long and short of it is, history tells you these states can change. I'm just saying it takes some time, and it takes some attention. Let's see. Eric Atkinson writes, the sheer quantity of civil liberties and personal freedoms we have now, it seems to me, is greater than it's ever been in our nation's history. Half the population at the time of our independence were slaves, and remained so for another 80-plus years, followed by another 100 years of very limited rights. Women didn't get the right to vote till the 20th century, and had few other rights besides. There's a constitutional right to privacy today that didn't even technically exist until a 20th century Supreme Court decision, and ditto with the freedom of expression, which today covers a massive spectrum of activities that was never imagined by the Founding Fathers. We have legions of lawyers in courts today precisely because we have more rights than we can ever shake a stick at. And with so many rights, someone's right to do something is always infringent on someone else's right to do something, or to be free of what other people are doing with their rights. It's absolutely true that the government, local, state, and federal, on occasion oversteps its boundaries and violates someone's rights somewhere, somehow. Sometimes it's a result of bad policy, and sometimes it's just the result of human error or willful disregard of the law. But instead of the general accumulating loss of freedom that so many alarmists warn about in their slippery slope or frog in boiling water analogies, the history of American liberty shows a trend of peaks and valleys, with the government overreaching during times of crisis and passing laws and restrictions that eventually get repealed. Happened in the first 10 years of our existence with the Alien and Sedition Act, suspension of written habeas corpus during the Civil War, prohibition, etc., etc. Thanks, Eric. Lyndon Johnson once said that don't talk if you can't improve the silence. And I'm tempted to just leave your statement as it is, because it's a good one. But, it is a little tempting to comment, so I will add the following thoughts. One, right off the bat, is that the presidency is not a powerful office as it appears. For President Obama, which some people are saying he's seizing power, or he's acting in a way contrary to the Constitution, you had George W. Bush as president, and there were some of the same comments. Oh, he's a dictator, he's acting contrary to the Constitution. George W. Bush, in contrast, lived in an enviable political situation that I believe made him look more powerful, and did make him indeed more powerful under our system, with 6 years of his party controlling Congress, and a relatively unified Congress it was. Carter only had 4 years of that. Reagan and George H.W. Bush had no years of that. Clinton had 2, and President Obama now, unless something changes, will have 2. So when Obama won the presidency, I was amazed with what supporters thought the presidency was going to do. Because even when you have a Congress of your own party, federalism invests powers in the state and local governments and the Congress, right? You don't elect Obama and then, as some might have thought, he padlocks Gitmo. That didn't happen because the president does not have ultimate executive authority. Congress played a role in opposing it. The governors and the mayor of New York, local and state officials, objected to the alternatives where the president might be located, and so it's open. That's one thought. If you like your president, you're giving him too much power. If you hate the president, you're giving him too much power. The other thought is that I agree that the total aggregate population has more rights now than in 1776 or even 1868. The counter, though, that I think you have to consider is that the government is also more present. And you have computers and cameras, and instead of a constable in a town, you have police forces. And some would argue a larger, more centralized federal government has more power now than would have been present in 1776. So it's true we have more rights, but there's also more threat. The counter to that counter is that the good old days wasn't necessarily so. We may think the early Americans faced no government, but I think the reality is that even in colonial times, early American times, for what they actually did, when they actually did something important, buy land, sell products, import goods, use a road, they faced the hand of government in its archaic form just as much as we do now. It was a smaller government, but they were a smaller population. First significant act of the new Congress under the Constitution was to build a vast federal court system, and that's 1790. Throughout American history, people went out to the frontier, right, to escape some of the rules, but they were escaping not just government, but escaping property ownership. It wasn't their property, so they had to move, and that's the reason for the westward expansion of the country. So we know you can get less government with less of a population. But with a larger population, don't you end up with a larger government because there are conflicting rights and more things to adjudicate. So great statement, Eric, and I will leave it for listeners to think and discuss. Admittedly, I'm kind of splotching the blue and red paint on the canvas on this one and not coming up with 600 detailed historical examples to support it. Just kind of leaving that one open for a little bit of discussion. I want to thank you for listening. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. We've got a Facebook site. Twitter is @myhist. You can tweet me. If you like the program, please tell someone about it. Thanks for listening.